Our theme for this year is prevention, the prevention of FASD, and we have a promising lineup ahead of us throughout this season. On September 26th, we opened the season with a presentation by Nancy Poole, who challenged us to think about what we know about prevention and whether we're actually doing prevention. Today, Kirsty Prasad will present the first of 3 consecutive sessions about working effectively with women who use substances. Today's session is entitled Values and Addictions. However, before I introduce Kirsty, there's a number of housekeeping tips I need to advise you of. One, you can ask questions throughout the presentation by using the question and answer module on the right-hand side of your screen. A session facilitator is monitoring the questions and will pose them at suitable times during the presentation to Kirsty. If we're not able to answer all your questions during the live presentation, we will answer them via email after the session is over. It is important that you include your email address when you ask a question, otherwise we have no way of contacting you or sending you an answer. The presenter's contact information can be found at the back of your handouts and on the final slide of the presentation. In order to receive a certificate of attendance, you must have signed in before 8:50 a.m. and you will receive that from Amy Castor. Evaluations for the session will be emailed to you after the session. Please fill them out and return them. We really rely on your feedback to continually improve the FASD learning sessions and also look at what other sessions we can offer that are FASD related. Today's presentation and handouts will be posted for viewing and downloading on the CMC website, which is fasd.alberta.ca. If you experience any technical issues, please email Clayton at Clayton, CLAYTON, KNOLL, at cmgcanada.ca. Also, please let your local tech support know if you're having any difficulties as well, because it may originate at your location. So as Alberta advances with the FASD 10-year strategic plan and moves into year 7 evaluation, education and training continues to play a key role. And we heard that throughout the Institute of Health Economics Consensus Development Conference. It was all about training, training, and training. And so part of the learning series is around teaching and training people about FASD. This is our 5th year of offering sessions and our 2nd year of delivering the material via webinars. We continue to offer video casting to the north because they're not always able to access the webcasting to that level. All sessions are taped and available on the FASD.alberta.ca website for your information. So we're pleased with the ongoing interest and attendance in this initiative. We appreciate the work of CASA, Child and Adolescent and Family Mental Health, and the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research in making this initiative such a success. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Kirsty Prasad. Kirsty's worked with the Alberta Health Services Enhanced Services for Women since 2002, where she works with women who use substances. In recent years, Kirsty's had training with other service providers in other strategies and techniques, and she's been able to perfect that work in Alberta Health Services. Prior to coming to AHS, Kirsty worked with Streetworks, a well-known program in the Edmonton area, and the mental health unit in the inner city. She has a strong knowledge and passion for working with marginalized populations with substance abuse concerns. We're fortunate that she's going to share her wisdom and experience with us for the next couple of sessions. So please join me in welcoming Kirsty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This morning, what we're going to start with is just kind of doing an overview around values and substance use and an introduction around gender issues in relation to women and substance use. But prior to that, I'll just give you a little bit of background on the program that I work in, which is the Enhanced Services for Women. And in regards to the program, it started in 2002 when back then the funding that we had was early childhood development funding. And it was an FASD prevention program, and we had to kind of look at what would be our priorities in regarding women who use substances and how can we better support women to access our services. And so what we looked at was one of our priorities is pregnant women. Another priority in regards to that is finding women to come and connect with us that don't necessarily access our services on an ongoing basis, or have connected over and over and over again and haven't been able to engage in services. And so what we ended up doing is we do one-to-one counseling, but we also provide outreach services, so we can meet women in the community to help support them. Versus them coming to us all the time, we can actually go to them. The other piece is, even though we do the outpatient services, we're also connected to our detox and residential services to provide ongoing support and continuity with working with women throughout our services, just so that what we do know best practice in regards to working with women who have addictions is that we support them, and they don't always have to tell their story over and over and over again, and so they have that one counselor throughout all of our services. The other part that we do also is we do a lot of prevention work, as well as presentations and community capacity. We work very closely with community partners in the in Edmonton and area, just to support the women we work with. Instead of referring to an agency, we find it's much better to be able to refer to a person and have that bridge, so that the services are much more seamless in how we support them. The presentation that we're doing today, I usually do a full day training, and we try and make it as interactive as possible, but given the scenario, we've kind of broken it down into 3 parts. Today we're going to talk about values in regards to women and substance use. The next session, we're going to actually go into much more information around gender-specific issues related to women. And the last session that we're going to end on is trauma, because that is a significant piece of the stories that the women that we see have. And so that's why it's kind of on its own. We will touch on it in all 3 sessions, but in the last one, we'll spend a lot more time in regards to trauma and substance use. And the reason why we start with the values and attitudes is just because it's really important. I always find the number one strength that the women that we see face is that they can read people. They are inherent in reading other people and knowing who they're walking into a room with. And so it's really important for us to kind of look at what are our beliefs, what are our thoughts, what are our values, and how we can best support the women that we see. And so that's why we start with kind of looking at ourselves as workers and support workers, and how do we support the women that we work with. And so we start with understanding our own thoughts on this, but also then we will look at some of the myths that are out there in regards to women and substance use. So the first one I'm going to start with is alcohol has the same effect on women as men. Is that true or false? False. False. Absolutely, it's false. Women and men are made up very differently. Men have much more muscle mass. Women have more fat. Physiologically, we also are made up very differently. We have our hormone levels are different, as well as men also have an enzyme in their body that can break down alcohol and other substances much more readily than it can for women. So when women are drinking or using other substances, it actually goes straight to the organs, and we have much more health consequences due to our use. And so men and women definitely have different effects, physiologically as well as socially. Women are prescribed mood-altering drugs more often than men. True or false? Absolutely, that's a fact. There's even been studies where men and women can go into a doctor's office with the same symptoms. More often than not, women will come out with a prescription for mood-altering drugs versus men. The other piece of it is women are more apt to access some of the mental health services as well. Women who abuse substances often have a history of physical or sexual abuse. True or false? Absolutely true. Health Canada has a stat that 85% of women that go into treatment have a history of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. There's been numerous studies that have been done in the States where their stats are about 90% of women who access addiction services have a history of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. I can say for my own anecdotal stories, it's 100% of who I see. I have women that have experienced physical, emotional, sexual abuse numerous times prior to getting into addiction as well as afterwards. And so that's why trauma is so significant, and it's a big part of the learning that we'll be doing as well. So women's dependence on alcohol often develops earlier in life than for men. Is that true or false? It's false. It usually happens later in life for women than men, but once women start getting into the pattern of abusing substances, it's much more telescopic and it becomes much more rapid. You can have a man who's been drinking quite heavily and he may not get into dependence for 15 to 20 years. For women, it can be 7 to 10 years. So it's much more rapid and much more telescopic for them. But it does tend to happen later in life. The health consequences of heavy drinking are similar for men and for women. Is that true or false? False. And part of it is what I talked about a little bit earlier, where alcohol and substances affect us very differently. Women have much more severe health consequences due to their use. And so they're more apt to having heart disease, cirrhosis of the liver, more prone to cancers, Korsakoff's, Wernicke's. Our menstrual cycles are greatly impacted by our substance use. And so a lot of times they may not have a regular cycle. That's another piece that for a lot of the women, it's not uncommon for them to come in and find out that they're pregnant in their second trimester just because they don't always have a regular cycle. And the other piece for that one that's really important is for the women we work with, they don't always have a GP. And it's really important that we get them connected to health services because of the effects of the substance use are much more severe on them, and so that intervention is very important. Men and women cite similar reasons for seeking treatment for their substance use. Is that true or false? False. Women tend to come into services for much more intrinsic reasons. It could be family, children, partners. For men, it tends to be more extrinsic. The number one reason why men come into treatment is because of impaired, so they're mandated by the court, or employment. And for women, it tends to be more intrinsic, so related to their family. There is a huge body of research that has been done on alcoholism that we can apply to our work with men and women. Would you say that's true or false? I think, when we first had this question put into our presentation, at that time, it absolutely was false. Because in the earlier days in regards to addiction treatment, it usually was research was done on men, for men, and the treatment centers, and even some of the programs were developed for men. Now what we're finding is men and women aren't the same. They present very differently, they come in for different reasons, and even when you're doing groups, you will find that even within a group setting, it's very different for men and women. And so there's much more research showing that the differences and the reasons why gender-specific programming is very important. I think the stat right now is 90% of the research that's been done about women around addiction treatment has been done since 1990. So it's not that old in regards to how long we've been looking at it, but I can say that there's a lot more research out there than there used to be, which is really good. So cocaine is the recreational drug when a woman takes it during pregnancy can cause the most harm to her developing fetus. Would you say that's true or false? False. Given the presentation that we're doing around fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, we know alcohol is a known teratogen. We know how damaging that can be to a developing fetus. The interesting thing about this one, I do some presentations to a variety of different settings, and sometimes when I go in, they actually say it's either cocaine or it's heroin. And it's not even that long ago that I've had that question say where that they say this is true, and if they say it's false, they say it's because it's heroin. And I find that quite fascinating that even till today, we still have some people that aren't as aware around the alcohol, and that alcohol is quite damaging. So would you say fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is 100% preventable? True or false? It's one of those technically true questions, but the fact is, addiction is very complicated. Pregnancy is not a cure for addiction. It's a huge window of opportunity, absolutely. A lot of women that I meet say they either quit or do cut down during their pregnancy, but we have to recognize that pregnancy isn't a cure for addiction. Addiction is very complicated. There's a lot of factors that go into why people are using and why they continue to use. And again, women don't always find out they're pregnant right away. Sometimes they find out in their second trimester, sometimes it's later. There's still conversations. I still hear people say it's okay to drink during your pregnancy. So there's still some of that messaging that's going out there. So technically, absolutely, but it's a little bit more complicated where it isn't. Women are more likely to have a dual diagnosis than men. True or false? Absolutely true. That's the other piece, that having the supports in place for women around their substance use, but also having the mental health piece is very, very important, because the chances are that they probably will have a dual diagnosis, whether it's depression, bipolar, PTSD, anxiety disorders. All of those areas are really important, and usually their mental health diagnosis precedes the substance use disorder. And that's the other piece. Sometimes for men it tends to proceed afterwards, for women it tends to proceed before. And so having that integrated support is very, very important, because if you're looking at supporting them in regards to recovery, a lot of times they're using to support the mental health and vice versa, and it's a vicious cycle. And so it's really important to have both sides supported. So more female alcoholics will attempt suicide, more men will complete. True or false? This one's kind of a trick question as well, because in the general mental health population, absolutely men complete. We know that, that's a fact. But when you look at addiction and you look at substance use, and so women are more likely to have a dual diagnosis, more women are prescribed mood-altering drugs, women are more likely to complete. They're much more suicidal, and they tend to be much more apt to completing when they're suicidal. So that's the other piece that we have to also recognize, is making sure we're supporting them around that, because they are more apt to completing. So research demonstrates that women do better in all women treatment programs. True or false? See, this is the one that there's a lot of more research coming out, which I'm quite excited about, because before we didn't have as much research to verify if that was true or false. I think the research is showing more and more that men and women should be in gender-specific programming, particularly early on. The research is showing that women tend to share a lot more within a gender-specific program and stay engaged within the programming. Research shows that men do well in mixed groups, because the women help the men share within that group, but then they tend to be much more reserved, so they do a little bit more caretaking within that group. And so they're saying that gender specific might be more of a best option. I always say it's important to have choice. I think it's really important that we have choice. The unfortunate thing is we don't have a lot of choice for gender specific programming for women. There's a lot more for men than there is for women, and I think having more options would be ideal for them, and having more options in regards to family treatment, because a lot of women can't take their children to treatment, and then they end up having to find ways to support the children while they go into residential treatment. So just a little bit more options, and that they have choice is what I find is the most important, because one of the things that we do know in regards to supporting them when they have addictions, particularly around, and I'll touch more on that in the third session around trauma, but also having them a part of the plan, and also having a choice within that plan, and empowerment. Empowerment and strength-based model is so essential when you work with women. And so if they have choice and they can gear their treatment plan, it's very, very important that we help them do that. So more women than men will experience depression after developing an alcohol problem. True or false? I kind of answered it already, but it's actually false. They'll develop it before, not afterwards. So substance abusing women are less likely to have partners who support them in treatment than substance abusing men. True or false? This one's also true. There's been some research where it shows 80% of women that go into residential treatment lose their partners, where 80% of men that go into residential treatment keep their partners. So that says a couple things. One, when we're asking women to go into recovery, we're asking a lot of them. We're not just asking them to quit using, we're asking them to change a whole lot in their life, and they may not be ready to end that relationship. A lot of the women we see also have partners who use, and so he may not be in a place where he's ready to quit using, or she may not be in a place that she's also ready to quit using. And so when we're looking at treatment plans and supporting them, we do have to involve the whole family in regards to that. So women state lack of childcare is the biggest barrier that gets in their way of accessing treatment. True or false? What would you say? It's actually false. Service providers always say this is number one. For the women that we see, it's not even in the top 5. What would you think the number one reason why women don't access treatment is? Shame and guilt. And so and this is part of the reason why we start with kind of reviewing what our values and attitudes are, because there's so much shame in relation to how they're feeling around their substance use, and there's a lot of different reasons around that. Some of it's societal, where we have different standards for women who use versus men. We can go back way back where women, it was illegal to show them in ads in regards to alcohol. Once they were allowed to go into bars, that they had to be escorted by a male companion. And then we bring it up to these till today, and there's this standard around mothers who also use. And even within some of our systems, sometimes we can put a lot of pressure on the mom that she needs to get healthy, she needs to get into recovery, and boys will be boys. And he doesn't have to do as much as she does because she's the primary parent and he's not. And that says a lot, where I still think that we also have to look at fathers also have rights. And we have to look at both sides of the coin in regards to the recovery piece as well. So, oh, that one's blank. Women are more at risk for interpersonal abuse. True or false? It's true, absolutely. I touched on that a little bit earlier in regards to women have a history of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. And in regards to their histories of trauma, they are much more high risk of that trauma being interpersonal by someone they know. So I'll give you an example. If you have a girl and a boy, who are they most risk having harm done to them by when they're growing up? Usually a family member. If you have a teenage boy and a teenage girl, who are they most risk having harm done to them by? Usually for the teenage girl, it might be a partner now, or still a family member. For a teenage boy, it could be a family member, or now you're getting into more like acquaintances, people they know but they're not very connected to. If you have an adult girl and an adult boy, who are they most risk having harm done to them by? For the girl, it's a partner. For the man, it's combat. And so when you look at a woman's lifetime history of the person that she's most at risk having harm done to her by, it's someone she loves and trusts. And so we are just at much higher risk for that interpersonal abuse. The reasons for no disclosure of her trauma are different for men and women. Would you say that's true or false? It is true. And what do you think that would be? For women, the number one reason why she sometimes doesn't disclose her trauma is because she fears she won't be believed. For men, shame. Absolutely. For women, PTSD precedes or occurs simultaneously with a substance abuse disorder. For men, it precedes the PTSD symptoms. So for men, it happens afterwards. For women, it happens before. Would you say that's true or false of the substance use disorder? Absolutely true. A lot of times for us as women, we are usually using to cope with something that's going on in our life. I always use the description that substance use is a symptom of something else. And when you peel that onion away, you have to get to the core of what's going on. And so for her, there's a lot of other things that are going on that she's using the substances to cope with and to deal with. People who have experienced trauma have a high rate of substance use. Would you say that's true or false?
True.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And I think that's the other piece, and I'll talk more about it when we do the trauma and the addiction part, but that's another piece that maybe we don't always screen for. And so sometimes we can misinterpret what's going on for her by thinking, oh, okay, it's just anxiety, or she might be in withdrawal, or we're not always screening for the trauma history, and that could be what's at the core for her, and it might be missed people must wait to have abstinence from drugs and alcohol before they can work on their trauma symptoms. Would you say that's true or false? True. It's false.
No way.
Yeah. And so one of the things that, with more and more research and best practices that are out there, I know there's been that belief in regards to women, or men and women, anyone who has trauma history, they have to wait. I think sometimes I hear a year, sometimes I hear 2 years. You have to be in recovery for a couple years before you need to work on it. I've even heard the analogy, put it in a little box, put it on the shelf and leave it there and just focus on recovery. But we have to look at every person as an individual. And sometimes they cannot get clean and sober because they cannot cope with the nightmares, the flashbacks, the hypervigilance. And so it's not to do the trauma therapy where you do the regurgitation of what happened, but it's what you need to do is to teach them the skills and coping strategies to deal with today. So how they deal with the hypervigilance, how they deal with the flashbacks, how can they emotionally regulate and also contain in the moment, today and now. And so we can do a lot of support and a lot of work around that, talking to them about what safety is and what that means for them and how they can stay safe, and then also connecting them to other services to support them in a very holistic way. So there's a lot we can do without having to take them back, but we can work on today with them. So trauma symptoms may at times look like withdrawal symptoms or using behavior. True or false? Absolutely true. I think sometimes we can misinterpret that they may be in withdrawal or still using when they're actually very symptomatic around their trauma symptoms. And so it's important, that's the other piece that's important to recognize and have that lens around the trauma and how it presents, one-to-one as well as within group settings, so we can support them through that. So trauma recovery has a high relapse rate around substance use. Would you say that's true or false? It's true. Absolutely true. And so that's the other piece why sometimes women, and as well as men, when they go into recovery, sometimes they have a harder time coping with the hypervigilance. They've used different substances to cope with some of the trauma symptoms, and I'll talk about different reenactment symptoms that they'll use substances for. And so when we take the substances away and we haven't actually put in place ways to cope with what's going on, they will have a hard time coping, and so there's a huge relapse rate if we're not working on all the different areas of their life for them. So just before I move into this section, is there any questions in regards to the myths and facts that I'll throw out there right now, or in the room at all?
Just a quick one.
Yes.
Around the trauma and dealing with trauma while a person is either using or not using or stopped using.
Yes.
What was your response to that again? I got really confused.
Oh, sorry, no worries. So what I was saying that, because sometimes people think working on trauma means you have to go back and you have to do some of the trauma therapy where they regurgitate the story of what happened and how it happened so they can do the healing. What I'm saying is that you can also work on the trauma without having to go back. So you start with safety. You start with coping skills and emotional regulation as well as the containment so they can deal with the present day. And that could be grounding activities. That could be doing an inventory around what's going on and what safety means for them. Talking to them about their identity, boundaries, what that looks like for them. And so you can support them in the today, here and now, without having to go back. But it's important that we give them skills and ways to cope if we're asking them to go into recovery. Because a lot of times their substance use and their trauma symptoms are very interconnected. Yes?
It might be my own thinking, but I perceive that it's almost impossible to deal with trauma if using, or if you're in a using state, right? Because the next myth or whatever, just after it's said that trauma
Has a high relapse rate.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And that's the reason why we need to be very holistic in our approach. So if we just take the one piece and take away the substance use and just focus on that, and we haven't dealt with the mental health, we haven't dealt with anything else that's going on, chances are they probably will relapse. So we have to look at the whole picture to be able to support them to heal. And it doesn't mean they have to go back into their history of trauma. It means that we teach them ways to cope, because one of the things, particularly for the women that we see, And because a lot of them have a long history of trauma, which usually started in childhood all the way to adulthood, they haven't learned how to cope. They don't know how to emotionally regulate. They don't know how to have healthy relationships, boundaries, identity, affect regulation. All those parts of their lives are greatly impacted. So it's important that we are able to support them through that too. Yes?
I'm just wondering, do you think it's possible to help teach some of those coping skills while they're still using?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Because then you can look at safety. And that's where you start, right? You start with safety and what that means for them, because safety, what means for us and them are very different. And grounding activities and containment and how to support them through that. So you can do that now while they're still using it. Actually can help when they may be triggered even with their substance use. And Jean, yes.
Kirsty, we've had a comment from the virtual audience.
Okay.
They'd like you to repeat the questions when you're answering them because
Okay.
they can't actually hear the question.
Perfect. Yes, I definitely will. Yes. And so the next section that we're going to touch on is values and attitudes. And one of the questions we start with, can I act and support a woman even though she may be putting her baby at risk? And I think that's a very important question to ask. One of the luxuries of the position that I'm in, because I get to go to so many different sites and see women in a variety of different areas within Edmonton, I can see how subtle it can be, where someone might be putting the baby first and forgetting about the mom. And I have a philosophy where it's, if you want to support the baby, you have to mother the mother. And that's the best way to support both of them, is we have to support mom. And so I've seen it where I've had women access services in an agency, and the person at that agency has said, you know, there's more than you here you need to think about. What kind of message does that send to her?
You're not as important as that baby.
And the comment was, you're not as important as that baby. When I talked about earlier, the number one reason why women don't come to treatment is because of her feelings of shame and guilt. We've just created a lot of shame for her, a lot of guilt. And my statement, and I've heard women say this, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm accessing services. I know I need to go into recovery. I've never met a mom who doesn't care about her baby, not once. In all the years I've been working here, I've not met a woman who does not care. And so this one's a really important one. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest strengths that they have is reading people. And that's how they stay alive. And so if we're a little bit uncertain about how we feel about things, it will seep into the work that we do. And it will seep in by refusing services. It'll seep in by doing the lecturing with them. And it can actually push them away from coming in and accessing services. Another one is, could you work with a woman who abuses her children? If she stays in a violent relationship, and I'll touch on this one a little bit because I think the stat right now is women will leave about 10 times before she leaves for good. I know the stat used to be 7. I think it's about 10 now. And the reason why I touch on this, because there's a lot of education out there around domestic violence and our understanding of that and knowing that women will leave multiple times before she's able to leave for good. But I also see where, within my own practice, I see where women are treated a certain way if they do stay. And I think it's important that we kind of really recognize how we feel about that, because of course we're in the field to support the women. I mean, that's who we are as workers. That's why we're here. We want to be able to support them, and sometimes we can be 20 steps ahead of them. And we need to kind of back up a little bit because she may not be where we are. And I'll give you an example where I had a lady who had left. She phoned and she was working with another worker with me, and she's like, okay, I'm ready, let's go. We had a plan. We were getting her into a shelter, phoned her support worker, and the worker said, you know what, when she's gone for good, that's when you can call me, because we've done this before. And so she refused service. And I've had another one where a lady was showing up to an agency, and she'd come there every day, and she'd sit on the couch, and I was at a meeting, and a worker from that agency said, you know, we stopped talking to her now because she keeps coming in with new bruises. And so we're frustrated. And, you know, I was like, well, you know, the one place she feels safest is where she's going every day, because that is where she feels safest. That's why she goes every day. And so when she may be ready to leave that relationship, who is she going to ask support from? The agency she goes to. But now you've disengaged, disconnected from her. You ignore her when she walks in. You don't even say, hey, how are you? How was your day? She has nowhere to access to be able to leave. And so I think it's important that we kind of really be in tune to how we feel about certain things and do some of that self-reflection, because again, it can seep in subtly into our practice, and we may not even recognize that we're maybe refusing services, or maybe a little bit more frustrated with what's going on. And I also say, no matter what the decisions are that the women we work with, it's still their decisions, and we're here to support them regardless of the decisions that they make. If she earns a living in prostitution, the reason why I have the word prostitution up there is just because it's a universal term. We all know what that means. I know there's a lot of other terms around sex trade, sexual exploitation, and I want to make sure I recognize all three of those. But in regards to this piece, again, with the women I work with, majority of them are sexually exploited. Majority of them have been sexually exploited from a very young age. I know for Edmonton, what do you think the average age for women getting into prostitution is? 13. And for men, it's 14. And I know one of the youngest that they found in Edmonton actually working on the street is 9. And so that's a very young age. Again, a lot of the women we see are also sexually exploited by a person that they care about. It's usually a family member, or again, a partner. And I always say the work that we do with them is a lot slower, a lot more in depth, and a lot longer. I always use the analogy, it's like their soul has been shattered, and it takes so much longer to be able to kind of try and put those pieces back together again. And again, there is a lot of stigma in relation to this, and I see that quite often. If she drinks and uses during her pregnancy, and if she's angry and violent. And the reason why that one is up there, again, is there's a lot of different beliefs in regards to women. And this can go back historically, again, when medication was prescribed for women for histrionics because of our emotional issues, those kind of things. But the other piece is, it's interesting that I hear so many times that we see women maybe presenting a certain way, and they may show their emotions a lot more. But there's this disconnect that women shouldn't be angry and women shouldn't be violent. And if they have a history of violence, or they have a history of being angry, I've heard workers and I've heard people say, I can't work with them. I prefer to work with men. And there's a lot more stigma around that. And I'm not sure what that is. And I don't know if it has to go back again with the beliefs around women and how we present, and society-wise, or what that is, but I've heard a lot more stigma in relation to that. And I just say, given for some of them what's going on, anger is a natural emotion, and sometimes they have a right to be angry. And, you know, and again, women can also be violent, and so we shouldn't refuse services based on that piece. So when you're working with women, oh yes, you have a question.
Diana from
Diana from the Edmonton Young Offenders Centre was asking, what type of programs are we utilising for young offenders who are incarcerated and in the community?
So the question is, what kind of programs are utilized for young offenders in the Edmonton area?
Presumably because they're based in Edmonton, but just in general, I guess.
Oh, that's
specifically for incarcerated and in the community.
okay. It kind of cues me, because one of the things I forgot to mention in regards to the program I work in, Enhanced Services for Women, we also got funding through Children's Mental Health for a program based with the same model that we have in regards to working with women. And our mandate there's 2 of us in Edmonton that work in this program. The mandate for us is women of childbearing years, which is quite large, from like 12 to 53. My coworker had a 53-year-old pregnant with triplets. So it's a huge age range, right? I know, shocking, 53, I know. No fertility drugs either. And it wasn't fertility drugs, nothing like that. So, I mean, for the two of us, that's a huge age range. When we got funding through Children's Mental Health for a program based on the same thing, we just call it Action 22 just because that's where the funding's from. They work specifically from 12 to 24. And the benefit from that is it's that age specific. A lot of the programs directed at youth end up being the age out around 17, 18, if not 19. Sometimes they'll be able to stay on a little bit longer. With them, they can work with them throughout that aging out process. So they also are able to go into some of the correctional centers. They go to EYOC, YYC. They go into some of the residential centers in regards to the addiction, but they also work with more of the high-risk population. I know with Children's Services, they used to have the high-risk youth, and I believe that's now no longer, but they used to work with that unit quite often. I think there's a lot of programs in relation. I think what I could do, what would be more appropriate, is if I get the email, and then I can just make a list. That would be more beneficial for them, and I can make a list of specific services in relation to that, so that ones that are within incarceration and outside, and then different agencies and contact numbers, I can make a list for that for sure. Okay. So when we're working with women, do you ever take that lens and look at, okay, what is unique about women and their substance use? Do we ever ask that question? Do we ever ask within our practice, do we have that lens when we're working with them? And when we meet with someone, do we take that lens and apply it to, if it's one-to-one groups or even programming that we do? And do we ask the question, what is unique about them? And how do I apply that knowledge to support the women that come through our doors? So when you're working with them, what's unique about them? So some of the things that we need to take into consideration is health. I touched on earlier, again, the physiological factors. I briefly touched on that and the impacts that they have around their health and how important it is for them to have support around that. It's not uncommon for the women we see to not have a family doctor. Again, I know family doctors are very difficult to find, but also the only time, if you ask them when was the last time they had a full medical, sometimes they'll say it's when I went to jail or when I was pregnant. And so a lot of them don't have the proper health care taken into place. The other piece is, if we take the lens of they have a long trauma history, a lot of them do fear going to the doctor as well. I have women that will actually even leave detox because there's a physician on site, and they'll leave because they fear that they'll have to see the physician, because they don't want to be touched. Even if the physician's not going to touch them, it's just the thought that someone might be touching them. And so the health piece is quite significant for them. I find a lot of times what they end up doing is doctoring themselves, or they'll wait till they get so sick they end up going into emerge. And for some of them, sometimes the emerge is safer because there's a lot of people around, and that's why they tend to go to the emerge more often than actually going into a doctor. So finding a doctor that's quite supportive to them is really important. Her feelings of guilt, stigma, and shame, we've touched on that quite a bit already, but I can't emphasize that enough in regards to that, and how sometimes I use the analogy, it's like a 500-pound rock on her shoulders, and she's carrying that around, and how significant that is for her when she comes into services. And we'll find that sometimes they'll come in and they'll meet with you for a little bit and they'll leave, and then they'll miss a bunch of appointments. Then they'll come in and then they'll leave, and then they'll miss a bunch of appointments. And part of it is they're just kind of testing the water and taking their time to build that relationship. And I find the Therapeutic Alliance, no matter what intervention you use, that's the best indication of success, and having that Therapeutic Alliance. And it doesn't mean how we feel about them, it's really how they feel about us. And sometimes that takes quite a long time to build that. And so I have women that it's taken a few years for that relationship to actually be built. And so it can be quite a slow process. Her experience of violence, again, that's another piece. A lot of the women we see tend to be in relationships and that aren't as healthy, and they do tend to be quite violent. The other piece to that is they've also experienced, even if it's people they know on the street and experience violence that way. And that's another piece in regards to their health that's important to recognize, because a lot of times they've been hit in the head a lot and they've never been checked out. And so it might be important for them to be checked out, because it might appear that she has cognition issues, or I've heard people say, I think there's some developmental disabilities going on, or something's going on for her, and she may actually have some brain injury that hasn't been treated or diagnosed for her because of the amount of violence she's experienced and how many times she's been hit in the head. Co-occurring mental health problems, again, just the piece around the mental health and making sure that our approach is very holistic. In our site, we're quite lucky. We now actually have 3 psychiatrists that work with us that also understand the addiction as well as the mental health and how the two interact and what works for them in regards to medication and what won't work for them. And it's really important to engage the mental health piece and having that holistic approach. Women as mothers, I touched on this a little bit already in regards to some of the stigma related in regards to women who also use and are parenting. And misinformation and denial among those in position of help. I think that one's quite significant as well. Not only is there a lot of myths and facts in general, I think there's a lot of myths even within our own field in regards to substance use and women and addiction and pregnancy and all of that. And so it's important that we're aware of that misinformation. And I'll give you an example of where it can be quite harmful, where I had a lady. Actually, she was actually a teen. She was 17 and she was pregnant and she was using meth. And once she found out she was pregnant, she did quit. She was in her 3rd trimester. She was feeling quite triggered. She was quite worried about relapse. Came to her workers and said, you know what? I'm nervous about relapsing. What can I do? I'm feeling quite anxious. I have a lot of triggers going on. I'm stressed. What can I do? And the worker said to her, you know, if your baby's going to be born alive, you're going to be lucky. And if your baby is born alive, your baby probably won't last if you use. Completely false information. I think they were using the scare tactics. I think they thought of scare tactics, if I scare you into not using, you won't use. And so what do you think ended up happening with that young girl? We never saw her again. And it was the first time she ever accessed support. She was going to prenatal, she was coming to programming, she was quite involved in services, and we actually never saw her again from that moment on. And so our words are very powerful, and I always say that language is exceptionally powerful. And so if we're not sure of the information we're passing on, we probably shouldn't pass it on unless we know for sure it's accurate. And even then, we still have to tread water lightly and how we pass that information on, again, because it's so powerful. And if we pass on information that isn't accurate, we can do a lot of harm. So it's important, that piece. Again, even when I said that there's that information around women, it's okay to drink during your pregnancy, I still hear that. I still hear people tell women it's okay, make sure you drink so you can breastfeed because it helps with lactation. I still hear that today, but there's medication you can use, right? So you don't have to actually drink to actually lactate, but I still hear today it's okay to do that, and sometimes people are encouraged. So again, there's a lot of misinformation out there. The other piece that I'm going to touch on in regards to working with women is having a comprehensive integrated approach. So I'm going to talk about theory just a little bit, and I'll just touch on it really quickly. When you're working with women who have addictions, having a really good knowledge of what the theory of addiction is very important. I think the piece that tends to be missed in regards to that is when women relapse, because relapse is inherent within recovery. Majority of the people do relapse. It's very rare for people not to relapse. And so I use the analogy, it's like a child learning how to walk, and that child falls a few times before they can actually continue walking. And recovery, relapse is completely a part of that. And sometimes people get frustrated when women relapse. And I actually say it's a great learning opportunity, and it's a good way to look at, okay, what was your triggers, what was going on for you. But also, usually when they do relapse, they don't use as much, and they use for a shorter period of time, which is a huge success for them. And so we can actually use that as an opportunity of learning versus looking at it as a negative. having a holistic health model. I've touched on that quite a bit. Having a women-centered approach. Again, looking at, okay, what is unique about women and how do we put that into practice when we work with them? What is it that they're probably going to be presenting with, and how can we support them, whether it is, again, individual, psychoeducational, or in a group process. Understanding women's psychological development, and that where we touch on the relational model, and that's from the Stone Center in the States. And the relational model touches on the theories of psychological development, where usually to have a healthy adult, you have to mature and have independence and autonomous, and you have to separate from family once to be able to have a healthy relationship and be a healthy adult. What the relational model says for women, it actually is the reverse. Our connections and our relationships are integral to who we are, and we're very connected to those relationships. And that, if we focus on trying to separate that from them, we actually could be doing more harm to them. So we have to be very cognizant of the relationships that we have and supporting them within that context, because we develop differently than men in regards to that. And so that even goes into, sometimes we'll hear people say, you know, you just need to focus on yourself, don't focus on other people. And there's a lot of truth to that, but we also have to validate that we still see ourselves in relation to the people around us. So that could be our partners, that could be our children, that could be our siblings or our parents, and those relationships are integral to our recovery. And sometimes working on those relationships are very important. Again, women tend to have relationships that have men who also use, or their partner could be female and that partner also uses, as well as the family of origin they grew up in. Addiction is quite often the case for them as well, and so they also have family members who use. And so it's important that we look at all those pieces and the relationships that they have with them. And then again, having a really strong understanding of trauma and how it impacts them and how it presents. My next question is, and this might be an issue or it might not be, it just depends on your place of work. Do you find it hard to talk about substance use with the people you work with? And asking that question sometimes can be important, because it can help us kind of reflect on, okay, what is it around substance use that makes me feel uncomfortable? For some people, they have said, because I have family members. And sometimes I relate what's going on with the person in front of me to what's going on in my personal life. People have said, you know, if they open that can of worms, if I ask them about their substance use and they tell me, what am I going to do with that information? I feel like I don't have enough to be able to offer them. And so just kind of reflecting on it, is it hard to talk about that? And I can throw it out to the virtual world, and I'll throw it out to the room as well. Do you guys find it hard to talk about substance use at all? Is it part of your assessment process? I think some agencies have it integral into their assessments and some agencies don't. And I think, and if you don't have it a part of it, make it a part of it, just asking them around their substance use. And I think also wording it in a way that you're not asking about substance abuse, because you're implying that they have an addiction or a problem with their substances. I think if you ask them around, do you use or have you used, and just asking a general question versus asking about abuse, or do you have a problem with alcohol or problematic use with crystal meth? Because if you ask if they have a problem or insinuate that they have a problem, they may feel like they don't, that they may answer no. And so it's just about how you word that question and asking, and how we put that in part of our assessments. And the last slide that we'll touch on is, I think sometimes, I guess part of it is basically how we define success, right? Sometimes we define success as, okay, abstinence, and the person I'm working with has quit, and we see big changes in their life. And I think sometimes it's important to recognize the small successes. Instead of looking at it as like a 12-step program, look at it as like a 1,000-step program. And we recognize all the small successes for them and how we support them. And I know, the one thing I do know for the women that we work with is, regardless of how much time you spend with them, how that interaction happened and is what she'll remember. So if it was a positive interaction, she'll always remember that. I have women that have come back to me and said, I met this nurse and she only spent about 5-10 minutes with me, but I've never forgotten how well she treated me, and I wish I could go back and say thank you. I always have those stories with everyone that I've worked with, so it doesn't matter how long you've worked with them. Sometimes we don't always see the progress because they've worked with us for a bit and then they move on and go somewhere else. But just always to remember, no matter what, we always have an impact, regardless of how small or how short of the time that we spent with them. So any other questions in regards to, the values, attitudes, substance use? Yes.
Just a question, Kirsty, have you any information about the role that the media plays in establishing values and attitudes towards the things that you've been talking about?
That's a really good question. I know historically there was a lot of stigma and shame related to women in regards to their substance use, particularly around the alcohol. There's a lot of shame around that. Interestingly enough, and if we go back to teens, the ones that are at most, who do you think's the risk of having the highest amount of drinking as teens? Young teens, so junior high age. It's actually girls. Boys used to actually drink. Historically, they've always started drinking earlier and have been exposed to alcohol much more readily than females. But what we're finding now, it's actually reversed, and there's much more drinking happening for young girls and much more binge drinking for young girls. And it's a really good question because I think media and advertising and all of that is very powerful, not just with substance use, but also for women in general and how we view ourselves. And I think there's quite a bit of research around that as well. And the other piece that I didn't even touch on in regards to for women also is eating disorders. There's a huge correlation between women and substance use and eating disorders. And so that piece is also something we also have to make sure we recognize and inquire about when we're working with them, because what we find is once they go into recovery around their substance use, their eating disorders flare up. And it gets they get quite symptomatic around that, where they've actually talked about at one of the residential centers, they have to call people to come in and fix their plumbing often because women are purging so much in treatment. And so it's really important that that's another piece that we take into consideration as well. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? The next session will go into a lot more depth around gender and substance use. I've touched on it within the myths and facts and throughout this brief presentation right now, but we'll go into much more depth around the gender-specific issues. I'll touch more on what that might look like, how that impacts them, and why it's important to look at what's different for men and women, so when we're supporting them in regards to their recovery. And then again, the last one will be on the trauma and going into much more depth around trauma reenactment, and how their substance use is greatly intertwined with that, and how some of the substances can replicate some of the trauma symptoms, and that's why they might be using as well. So, thank you very much.
Were there any other questions from the virtual community? So just to let you know, there's about 220 people attending your session today from across Canada and all over. So, Kirsty, thank you very much for a great presentation. We need to link in because Alberta's going to launch the prevention conversation in the fall. Yes. And so that'll be a key piece that we need to do some work with you on. So again, thank you very much. Please fill in the evaluations. That's critical for this initiative, and so you will be receiving them within the next 2 business days. Please ensure that you've also signed in the attendance sheets at your site as well. Your feedback on all levels is very important. So on November 20th, Kirsty will be exploring gender-specific approaches and issues in substance use. So thank you very much and have a great day, and it's a beautiful day in Alberta. Thank you.